Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker and today's video is a continuation of my NBA season preview series for the 2019-20 NBA season, and this one covers the Boston Celtics. The Celtics finished with a disappointing 49-33 record last season because going into the season, a lot of people thought that they were going to be really good. There was a lot of excitement. They had plenty of depth. They had stars like Kyrie, Irving, and now Horford. And I personally thought that they were one of the best teams in the league going into the year and were a legit title contender in my mind. But as many of you guys know, the season just went completely off the rails. It was all the Kyrie Irving drama, and things just did not go well really for a consistent period of time. At any point during the season, they ended up losing in the second round in 5 games to the Milwaukee Bucks. And then they went on to have one of the busiest off seasons in the entire league, and let's go ahead and review that. First up in terms of additions is obviously going to be Kemba Walker, and this is a player that I've talked about a couple of times on the channel relatively recently, most recently putting him in a video in which I basically explained that I think he could take a step back from a statistical standpoint this season simply because the supporting cast around him will be better in Boston than it was in Charlotte, so he won't be scoring as many points, or at least he won't need to score as much for this Boston Celtics team, but I still think he's going to be very good for them. As I've explained in the past, I think his game fits a little bit more of what Brad Stevens likes to do on offense than Kyrie's more isolation style game, because Kemba can do a little bit more off of dribble handoffs in addition to ball screen and isolation stuff, and then can obviously shoot off the ball as well. Not that Kyrie can't do those things, it just seems like Kemba is more willing to do those kinds of things. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him used in a more Isaiah Thomas, the Boston Celtics version of Isaiah Thomas-like role, rather than a lot of the isolation ball screen stuff that we saw from Kyrie last year. So I'm expecting a big year from him. Again, just statistically, maybe a little bit less in terms of per game scoring, simply because the supporting cast around him is better and he won't have to score that many points for this Celtics team. Moving on now to their second big, free agency addition, and that is Enes Kanter, who they brought in to obviously replace Al Horford, who I will get to in the subtractions section. And I'll talk more about Kanter's role and his impact on this team once I get to the depth chart section, but obviously he's going to be a good rebounder offensively and defensively, scoring the paint, really not do a ton outside of that offensively except for some occasional post scoring, but he was really important and really critical to the Trailblazers when he showed up there after they had some injury issues at the 5 spot. So a good pickup, even though I'm not sure that you really want him to be your starting center if you want to contend for one of the top seeds in the Eastern Conference this coming season. And now we get to the draft additions for the Boston Celtics, and they had numerous picks going into this draft, and the highest one was Romeo Langford at 14th overall. And I'm going to get to him a little bit more later in the players to watch section, but I'm really intrigued and interested to see how he plays for this team, because he was an extremely talented high school player, someone that can certainly score the ball, but wasn't in a great situation in Indiana, fought through some injury stuff. I don't want to step too much on what I'm going to talk about later on in the players to watch section, but I am definitely interested to see how well he plays for this team, simply because he is very talented, and I like the pickup for them to kind of provide them a little bit more backcourt depth that they lost, or replace some of the backcourt depth that they lost over the offseason. Next up now, another draft addition, this one in the front court, and it is Grant Williams. And this is a player that I'm not certain is going to be all that good in the NBA, simply because he doesn't really have like a defined role or really good skill outside of just being a bigger body, someone that can score in the paint, someone that can rebound, but he's not huge like height wise, and so I don't really know if he's going to be a 4 or 5. I don't know if he's skilled enough to play the 4. I don't know if he's tall enough to play the 5, but I do think it's at least an interesting addition, and if he can find a way to compensate for his general lack of height and play the 5 spot, I do think that's an interesting role for him. But when you look at the depth chart for this team, they do already have plenty of other options at the 5 spot. So I'm not sure how he really fits in with this team unless he figures out a way to really work on his skills and develop his skills to be a skilled 4 that can potentially shoot and play make and attack off closeouts and things like that. And then last up now in terms of additions is another drafted guy. Typically I don't talk about second round picks in these previews, but I am going to talk about one in this one, and that is Carsen Edwards. He got a lot of attention later in the year with his NCAA tournament performances, and then had a really good summer league, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if he ends up being a good player for this team off the bench this year, and then moving forward is kind of a spark plug option. But I wouldn't get too terribly excited about him being like a hugely impactful player from an efficiency standpoint, because as you can see in college, he shot under 40% from the field despite obviously sky high points per game numbers, and I wouldn't get all that excited about a player that shot under 40% in college really being an outstandingly efficient and helpful and productive player as a rookie, as a second-round pick for the Celtics. There's certainly a lot of excitement here based off of his summer league play and his NCAA tournament play before he even got to the NBA, but I would maybe pump the brakes on that stuff a little bit, even though I think he could be helpful for them, just maybe in kind of different spots and not very consistently. Moving on now to the subtractions, and there are obviously some huge ones for this Celtics team. And you could argue that it's probably true that this team lost more than any other team across the NBA this offseason. The first one obviously is Kyrie Irving. You could certainly make the argument that this is going to be an addition by subtraction situation. He was traded from Cleveland to Boston, never really initially expressed a ton of interest in being in Boston when he initially requested the trade, ended up there anyway. Things seemed to be going very well, and then it all fell apart last year. And he has attempted recently to kind of give some explanation as to why he went from, preseason saying, if you'll have me back, I want to come back, to then ending up in Brooklyn as a free agent. But whatever the case may be, they're still going to miss him on the court. And in many ways, it was a career season for Kyrie Irving statistically last season, even though obviously all of the off the court and at times on the court stuff was kind of crazy. The team didn't have great chemistry, and he certainly caused a lot of drama. But again, I can't reiterate enough how great Kyrie Irving is as a player, and this team is still definitely going to miss him, even though he did cause all the drama that he did. Next up down subtractions is arguably a more impactful subtraction for the Celtics team, and definitely a more surprising one, and that is Al Horford. Going into the offseason, everybody knew that Al Horford had a player option, but really the only scenarios in my mind in terms of him being a free agent were that he would turn down his player option just to seek a new long-term contract with the Celtics because it seemed like he really enjoyed being in Boston, or he would just accept the player option to get, the almost $29 million in salary value that year and then become a free agent the following season. But very, very surprisingly, he ended up turning down that option and got a huge deal to go play in Philadelphia. And this hurts the team in multiple ways. Obviously, he was very good for this team at the 5 spot, specifically defensively. Fell off a little bit last year, but still a very good defender at the 5 spot and someone that they definitely could use on this team. Once we get to the depth chart, you'll see kind of how their 5 spot shakes out. But not only that, he went to a team that they play 4 times a year in their own division, as well as one of the other really good teams in the Eastern Conference that this team is going to be competing with for top 2, 3, and 4 seed. So that hurts them on multiple levels. Not only do they lose him off their team and all the things he did for them last year, but they also have to compete against him. A huge, huge loss for the Celtics. Moving on now to potentially another addition by subtraction candidate for the Celtics team, and that is Terry Rozier. Now, if you've watched any Celtics related video that I've made over the last year or so, you would know that I'm not a huge Terry Rozier fan. There's really very, very little evidence that he is a good starting caliber NBA point guard outside of the playoff run that he had now 2 postseasons ago when Kyrie Irving was hurt. Outside of that, there's very little evidence that he's actually a really good NBA point guard, and certainly someone that's not worthy of, being the main guy in Charlotte now on that team, getting the new big contract. I really wouldn't be worried if I was a Celtics fan at all about him leaving. And I know there were some initial fears once Kyrie decided to leave that Terry Rozier was somehow going to be the starting point guard of the Celtics next year. But again, he ended up going to Charlotte. They brought in Kemba Walker, so that all worked out. Really, in my opinion, not a huge loss for this team whatsoever, with the exception of the fact that he did have trade value that they could have capitalized on over the last year, and then maybe some of the drama that was caused wouldn't have been there, because I think it's pretty clear that him being upset with not getting as many minutes and as many shots after how well he played in the postseason certainly did play at least a small part in some of the issues they had last year. But outside of that, not a huge loss for this team. Moving on now, another important loss in this one is Marcus Morris. And this is a guy that just kind of provided toughness, interior scoring, a little bit of shooting, just kind of a little bit of everything, and was a good rotation piece for them. Ended up going to the Knicks. They are going to have to rely now on some other guys to provide them depth in the front court, specifically at the 4 spot. Once we get to the depth chart, you'll see that they definitely could use him on this team, but as long as some other players step up, it shouldn't be a huge, huge loss for them. And then last up, a player that they decided to trade away so that they could create the cap space to then sign Kemba Walker is Aron Baynes. They're going to miss pretty much everything that Aron Baynes gave them. He also had a really, really good World Cup as well for Australia, so maybe he's in for a bigger season than we expected in Phoenix. He's someone that actually learned how to shoot threes a little bit over the last few seasons. Really tough player inside, rebounder, defender, things like that, energy guy, and just a really good presence, someone you definitely want on your team. And honestly, realistically, if they had found a way to keep him, he could have been the starting 5 on this team and been really important and impactful for them. So I do think they're definitely going to miss him. Moving on now to the depth chart. I've mentioned this multiple times now up until this point in the video. I've got them with Walker at the 1, then Smart, Tatum, Brown, and Kanter, and then backing those players up, Edwards, Langford, Hayward, Ojale, Williams, Tice, and Williams. And really the starting five is very good until you get to the 5 spot, and that's what I mentioned earlier in the video, how you kind of get excited, right? You're like, oh man, Walker, Smart, Brown, Tatum, and then Enes Kanter. And no offense to him, again, he was a productive player last year, specifically for the Blazers. But when you get down to it, from a defensive standpoint, having him as your starting 5 is not ideal at all. And then in terms of the other positions, at least they do have the flexibility and the versatility to kind of just do whatever they want. They could even bring Smart off the bench. They could put Hayward at the 2 and go with a much bigger lineup with Hayward, Brown, and Tatum at the 2 through 4 spots. And then obviously Walker and Kanter. Wouldn't be surprised at all either if we saw maybe some Robert Williams at the starting 5 throughout the year, kind of messing around with that, bringing Kanter off the bench as more of a spark plug, a little bit of a post scorer and energy guy, and then putting Williams at the 5, depending on how well he plays. But then once you get into the depth, specifically in the backcourt, there could be some issues there because they're relying on some younger players. Again, unless Smart is coming off of the bench, they're going to be relying on Edwards and Langford coming off the bench at those 1 and 2 spots, which would definitely be a concern for me. Outside of that, they're going to need some players to step up at the backup 4 spots, like Ojale, like Grant Williams, again, because Marcus Morris isn't there. But I still really believe in this team from a talent, from a versatility, and most importantly, from a coaching standpoint. I think this is a team that really fits what Brad Stevens wants to do. I think it fits his style. I think some of these younger players are going to be hungry to really prove themselves after down years last year from Tatum, and in some aspects as well. Brown, who's in a contract year, is going to be seeking a big extension in the 2020 offseason. So I think there's a lot of motivating factors for these players, more so than the ones that were on the roster last year, even the guys that were there last year. I think the circumstances of this season lend themselves more towards bigger years from guys like Brown and Tatum, and maybe even Hayward as well, to the point that I think they're really going to be able to overcome some of the potential depth issues that they have, because these guys are very motivated, they're very versatile, and again, I believe in the coaching of Brad Stevens. Now to the players to watch section, and the first one probably isn't that big of a surprise, and it's Gordon Hayward, because if this guy can come back and be like 80% of what he was in Utah, it's going to be a huge help for this team. And I know that that continues to come up, but there were flashes last year that Hayward was starting to kind of come back to form, but there's still just a lot of hesitation with him taking off of the foot that he injured, the ankle that he injured, just kind of recovering from that injury. And a lot of people have said that that's really a 2-year recovery process. And so now maybe coming into the season, he will truly be a much better player for this team. But he's at the very least going to be useful. But again, I would put him in the players to watch section, because again, if he's 80 to 85% of what he was in Utah, that is a huge bonus for this team, whether he's starting, whether he's coming off the bench. Regardless, it provides them with another playmaker, another scorer off the bench, again, or starting, and that just makes everything else work so much better on this team, because it gives them a much more legitimate 7 to 8 man rotation once you get to the playoffs, and they don't have to rely so much on guys like Edwards and Langford coming off of the bench. Speaking of Langford, he's the other player to watch here. I mentioned him briefly earlier, and I'm not guaranteeing or saying that I really expect him to end up being a really good player, but I do think the circumstances of his college experience, his 1 year at Indiana, definitely lend itself towards him being undervalued in the draft, and then being in a more professional environment, in a better environment with Boston, him being someone that could really surprise some people. Again, an extremely talented player, highly touted high school player, and also just the injury issues that he experienced in Indiana likely really impacted his performance, even when he did play, even when he wasn't missing games, struggling to come back from those kinds of injuries and things like that. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a very productive player for this team off the bench, and potentially a long-term piece for them as well. So certainly keep an eye on him. Moving on now, in terms of expectations, I obviously definitely expect this Boston Celtics team to end up making the playoffs. In terms of my own prediction, I've got them at 52 to 55 wins and a top 4 seed in the Eastern Conference. And when you look at it, that's definitely realistic to have them, again, in the top 4 in the East. There's some really good teams at the top of that conference, and I'm putting Boston up there. And it might surprise some people that I'm putting them, potentially as a higher record this year than the 49 they put up last year. But strictly from a chemistry standpoint, I think this is going to be such a better team. Again, the difference between having Kemba Walker on this team and having Kyrie Irving on this team from an overall talent standpoint might be a slight drop off, but in terms of a chemistry standpoint, it was a huge upgrade. The only thing that really concerns me about this team is obviously the fact that Al Horford is no longer there and they're relying on Enes Kanter to potentially be their starting five throughout the entire season, barring some kind of trade. But even with this current roster, even with some of the minor depth issues that they do have in the backcourt, and again, question marks at the five, I believe in this team being good, potentially being a relatively big surprise in the Eastern Conference this season, and I would not be surprised at all to see them as a top 3 seed and a real threat, a legitimate threat to make the conference finals and potentially the finals, depending on how their season goes, potential mid-season moves that they make. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.